It's such a pleasure to be here at home, reading to you from a book which is about us and about here. I won't talk long now because you'll have 40 minutes of it. So I just start with the beginning of the book, and then we take it from there. The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, dedicated to the unconsoled. At magic hour, where the sun has gone but the light has not, armies of flying foxes unhinge themselves from the banyan trees in the old graveyard and drift across the city like smoke. When the bats leave, the crows come home. Not all the din of their homecoming fills the silence left by the sparrows that have gone missing and the old white-backed vultures, custodians of the dead for more than 100 million years that have been wiped out. The vultures died of diclofenac poisoning. Diclofenac, cow aspirin, given to cattle as a muscle relaxant to ease pain and increase the production of milk, worked like nerve gas on white-backed vultures. Each chemically relaxed, milk-producing cow or buffalo that died became poisoned vulture bait. As the cattle turned into better dairy machines, as the city ate more ice cream, butterscotch crunch, nutty buddy, and chocolate chip, as it drank more mango milkshake, vultures' necks began to droop as though they were tired and simply couldn't stay awake. Silver beards of saliva dripped from their beaks, and one by one they tumbled off their branches, dead. Not many noticed the passing of the friendly old birds. There was so much else to look forward to. The first chapter is called Where Do Old Birds Go to Die? She lived in the graveyard like a tree. At dawn she saw the crows off and welcomed the bats home. At dusk she did the opposite. Between shifts she conferred with the ghosts of vultures that loomed in her high branches. She felt the gentle grip of their talons like an ache in an amputated limb. She gathered they weren't altogether unhappy at having excused themselves and exited from the story. When she first moved in, she endured months of casual cruelty like a tree would, without flinching. She didn't turn to see which small boy had thrown a stone at her, didn't crane her neck to read the insults scratched into her bark. When people called her names, clown without a circus, queen without a palace, she let the hurt blow through her branches like a breeze and used the music of her rustling leaves as balm to ease the pain. It was only after Ziauddin, the blind imam who had once led the prayers in the Fatehpuri Masjid, befriended her and began to visit her, that the neighborhood decided it was time to leave her in peace. Long ago, a man who knew English told her that her name, written backwards in English, spelt Majnu. In the English version of the story of Layla and Majnu, he said, Majnu was called Romeo and Layla was Juliet. She found that hilarious. You mean I've made a khichdi of their story, she asked. What will they do when they find that Layla may actually be Majnu and Romy was really Julie? The next time he saw her, the man who knew English said he'd made a mistake. Her name spelled backwards would be Mujna, which wasn't a name and meant nothing at all. To this she said, it doesn't matter, I'm all of them. I'm Romy and Julie, I'm Layla and Majnu and Mujna. Why not? Who says my name is Anjum? I'm not Anjum, I'm Anjuman. I'm a mehfil, I'm a gathering of everybody and nobody, of everything and nothing. Is there anyone else you'd like to invite? Everyone's invited. The man who knew English said it was clever of her to come up with that one. He said he'd never have thought of it himself. She said, how could you have with your standard of Urdu? What do you think? English makes you clever automatically? He laughed. She laughed at his laugh. They shared a filter cigarette. He complained that Will's navy cut cigarettes were short and stumpy and simply not worth the price. She said she preferred them any day to Foursquare or the very manly red and white. She didn't remember his name now. Perhaps she never knew it. He was long gone, the man who knew English, to wherever he had to go, and she was living in the graveyard behind the government hospital. For company, she had her steel Godrej Almira in which she kept her music, scratched records and tapes, an old harmonium, her clothes, jewelry, her father's poetry books, her photo albums, and a few press clippings that had survived the fire at the Khabgah. She hung the key around her neck on a black thread, along with her bent silver toothpick. She slept on a threadbare Persian carpet that she locked up in the day and unrolled between two graves at night, as a private joke, never the same two on consecutive nights. She still smoked, still navy cut. One morning, while she read the newspaper aloud to him, the old Imam, who clearly hadn't been listening, asked, affecting a casual air, "Is it true that even the Hindus among you are buried, not cremated?" Sensing trouble, she prevaricated. "True? Is what true? What is truth?" Unwilling to be deflected from his line of inquiry, the Imam muttered a mechanical response. "Sach Khuda hai, Khuda hi sach hai." Truth is God, God is truth, the sort of wisdom that was available on the backs of the painted trucks that roared down the highways. Then he narrowed his blind green eyes and asked in a sly green whisper, "Tell me, you people, when you die, where do they bury you? Who bathes the bodies? Who says the prayers?" Anjum said nothing for a long time. Then she leaned across and whispered back, untree-like, "Imam Sahib, when people speak of color, red, blue, orange, when they describe the sky at sunset or moonrise during Ramzan, what goes through your mind?" Having wounded each other thus deeply, almost mortally, the two sat quietly side by side on someone's sunny grave, hemorrhaging. Eventually, it was Anjum who broke the silence. "You tell me," she said. "You're the Imam Sahib, not me. Where do old birds go to die? Do they fall on us like stones from the sky? Do we stumble on their bodies in the streets? Do you not think that the all-seeing, almighty one who put us on this earth has made proper arrangements to take us away?" That day, the Imam's visit ended earlier than usual. Anjum watched him leave, tapping his way through the graves, his seeing eye cane making music as it encountered the empty booze bottles and discarded syringes that littered his path. She didn't stop him. She knew he'd be back. No matter how elaborate its charade, she recognized loneliness when she saw it. She sensed that in some strange, tangential way, he needed her shade as much as she needed his, and she had learned from experience that need was a warehouse that could accommodate a considerable amount of cruelty. Even though Anjum's departure from the Khabgah had been far from cordial, she knew that its dreams and its secrets were not hers alone to betray. Thank you. Thank you. Sit there.
Are the mics working? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I am absolutely delighted to be here today, indulging in my favorite pastime, which is to talk about the God of small things.
You mean the Ministry of Utmost Happiness?
The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. I'm terribly sorry. That is a Freudian slip. And maybe the story about that will emerge during the conversation. And I'm told that a lot of the people here in the hall today have actually read the book and come, which actually for you, Arundhati, is a bit of a new experience, wouldn't you say? That when you've been on a tour, many people did read it, but it was very early for the book. But
yeah, the first lot of traveling was early, and just now I've just come back from Europe, where, unfortunately for European publishers now, people start reading the English book, so, but yeah, still, I guess it's just out, right, the book.
And I'm told that in India itself, it has sold about 90,000 copies, which is a lot. And I'm delighted that people here have read the book. And so I don't need to describe it very much, because each one of us will have our own descriptions of it. The way I look at the book, I see it as a kind of a scopious, sprawling landscape of vibrant characters, dynamic characters, moving across different kinds of locations. The narrative moves through a number of places, and in each space you have these ensemble of characters. Some of them, stay through the novel, others come and go, and some of them come and stay. And apart from the major characters that all of you are familiar with, and right now you introduce everybody to Anjum, and then there are, other characters like Tilo and Musa and Naga, and these are just the human characters. There's a whole range of animals and bugs and mammals and birds, and they come and they go, and some of them come and they stay. The question that I want to begin with, Arundhati, is something that you must have been asked, but I still must ask that, and that is, you have been, over the last 20 years, extremely prolific in writing non-fiction, and that writing has been bookended by two works of fiction, God of Small Things and Ministry of Utmost Happiness. And they are separated by 20 years. Why 20 years?
Well, of course I've been asked that many times, and I think when I answer it in other places and when I answer it here, what I say will be seen in a much deeper way here. But basically, after I finished The God of Small Things, and what happened with it, and the way it sort of just, it just blew my life apart in so many ways, in good ways and bad ways and all that. I used to wonder whether I would ever regret having written a book that, did, in crass terms, was so successful. But it just, around the same time was, of course, the time of the nuclear tests, and, I was somehow part of the sort of marketing of this international brand, and I really wasn't up for that. And when the nuclear tests happened, I felt that I didn't have the choice of keeping quiet, because whether I spoke or didn't speak, it was equally political. And I wrote The End of Imagination, which led me on a journey into worlds which really expanded my understanding of things. And as I traveled through, I wrote to explain things to myself as well as to readers. And those journeys and that writing sort of layered in me, and I felt something like a sedimentary rock, and there was much of what I was learning that was accumulating in me separate from the non-fiction argument. And that, at some point, reaches a critical mass, and I start to write The Ministry of Utmost Happiness.
the curious thing is that, once you've written a novel that has been incredibly successful, the temptation is always to kind of try to reproduce that form. In the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, you actually completely move away from that kind of form. As I said, that I like to describe it as a sprawling landscape, but it's also like a teeming metropolis of people, places, ideas, things, In fact, if I can just read a little bit from one of the later chapters, when one of the characters, Khadija, is taking Tilo across the city in Kashmir. And they travel, and I quote, through a maze of narrow, winding streets in a part of a town that seemed to be interconnected in several ways, underground and overground, vertically and diagonally, via streets and rooftops and secret passages like a single organism, a giant coral or an anthill. Now, this could well be, in my opinion, a description of the structure of the Ministry of Utmost Happiness. This is what happens when you catch up late with the book. My question is that doing something like this, which has a completely different literary aspiration, is also a huge risk. And why did you want to take that risk?
Well, one of the great risks of success and fame in the arts is that you could become domesticated, or you could domesticate yourself by wanting to replicate or sort of play in or reward people's expectations of that I would write the son of the god of small things or god of small things too. And for me, even when I wrote it, I was very clear that I was not setting out to become a professional novelist, that I would not just keep writing books. I would write a novel when I had the novel to write. So of course, after The God of Small Things, I had the option of signing up, for a huge advance, and having people manage me and sort of overtly or covertly tell me what to do, which I didn't want. And when I started writing the Ministry, I had the choice of being utterly experimental, and because I didn't do that, and yet there are things which, though they are very apparently different, I mean, The God of Small Things is a book, as I see it, a book about a broken family with a broken heart at its center. And in some ways, the Ministry sort of inverts that. And it's a book about people who start out broken, people who have shards of broken hearts, and they somehow bring them together in a graveyard and make a put together mended heart, But in terms of how, the games with trying to structure a novel or how you tell a story, to me, that's fundamental. To me, structuring a novel is the deepest joy that I have. Well, language is of course the construction material, but so I did want to experiment for myself. Obviously, if I was the kind of person who wanted to deliver on expectation, I wouldn't have written a single one of my political essays.
Yes, I think that's kind of fairly known and accepted about you. And now my question is actually going to be about God of Small Things, so it's not a slip.
We don't believe you.
You better. So, well, yes, it is a very, very different novel from The God of Small Things. But, the chapter that you just read out, where do old birds go to die? That's a line taken from The God of Small Things. And when you do read the books together, there are resonances, And I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about that. There must be some connection somewhere, isn't there?
Well, the question of where do old birds go to die is a question that Sophie Mole, a little girl in The God of Small Things, asks. And that sentence grew wings and flew into the Ministry of Utmost Happiness. But yeah, I mean, there are some connections which were deliberate, and then there are some connections which were not, and which I suddenly, right, these days I'm working with the Urdu translation, with the person who's translating it, and we read, and suddenly something flies up at me, and I say, oh, and there are some naughty little references for no reason but naughtiness. But the main, I think the main connection between the two books is the character of Tilottama. Because she is, to me, in my mind, she's the daughter of Ammu and Velita, had the God of Small Things ended differently. So she's the younger sibling of Esteban and Rahel. And Esteban and Rahel do have rooms of their own in the Jannat guest house. But there are other kinds of connections which, for example, there's a long chapter in The God of Small Things that's set in a cinema hall. And a cinema hall plays a very major part in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness in a very, very, very different way, And there are, of course, the cement kangaroos hopped across into the ministry, but those are just like slightly naughty connections. But then there's obviously political connections, For example, The God of Small Things, though people, and I would say particularly people in Kerala initially tried to kind of elide the heart of the book, which is a very political heart, The God of Small Things, although, the practice of caste by this Syrian Christian family, the tragedy of transgression when Ammu and Velita come together. In Kerala, when the book came out, 5 lawyers got together and filed the last chapter in court and said this book is corrupting public morality. Now, that politics comes into the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, of course, again in a totally different way, but Tilottama brings it in with her. But there are other characters too who carry that politics in. But so there are other things which I didn't realize. For example, suddenly I realized that there's a similarity in towards the end of The God of Small Things. You have this boat full of touchable policemen going down the Meenachal River. And in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, you have a boat full of army officers going down in that sense of dread. And of course, not least of all, both books end with with insects with personalities, Yeah, The God of Small Things has Chaputambaran, and the Ministry of Utmost Happiness has Guikyum, the dung beetle.
Just, going back to the Jannat guest house, which is now full of people who are...
We're just assuming, of course, everyone knows what that is.
We are assuming that everybody has read it. The Jannat guest house is in this graveyard, the place that Anjum creates, the Anjum about whom you read, has created this, this out of desolation, this place that, houses all kinds of social, sexual, and political dissidents. And it's a diverse cast of characters. Do they have something in common? I mean, how did they come into your imagination when you were thinking of writing the book? A question. Are they around?
They're here. Okay. Can't you see them?
I better be careful about what I say.
They're always around.
Yeah, that's why.
They moved in and they're not moving out. They're not going anywhere. But how do they come? I mean, to be honest, the truthful answer is that I don't know. And the truthful thing for me to say would be that when I'm writing fiction, I'm absolutely unable to talk about it. And even after like now, it's been a while since I finished, so I'm able to sound as if all this was planned. But it, in some ways, it's a process which is. Sometimes I've spoken about this as very much like city planning, where you make a plan, it gets ambushed, you replan it, there's a migration, and there are unauthorized colonies, there are all kinds of people who show up, and your plans are ambushed, and then you replan it. And yet, it's never a city always inscribes itself on the surface of the earth against the organic contours of nature. So it's always got a form, And so when you say sprawling, or when you truthfully, it's not a television series, because it's got a form that keeps circling in on itself. And obviously, when I started writing it, it isn't. I mean, even though Anjum starts the book, she was not the first. She was not the first person that I wrote about. She came knocking on the door much later. But the characters. I mean, you asked me, do they have something in common? Again, I wouldn't have known this while I was writing it, but now I know.
When you look back on it.
I know that all of them have borders running through them of some kind. Anjum has the border of gender running through her. Tilotoma has the border of caste running through her. One of the characters is called Saddam Hussein, and he is a young Dalit man who, when he is a boy, actually watches his father being beaten to death by a mob of people in 2002, and then he converts and becomes a Muslim and calls himself Saddam Hussein. And he has that border of conversion running through him. But then you have other characters like Musa, Tilottama's friend Musa, who's a Kashmiri, who has obviously a national border running through him. You have a character like Garson Hobart, who's, in some ways the most strange person in the book.
We will talk about him.
He also has a border running through him, So in some ways, all of us, we know that far from what the West thinks of India as an anarchic, bumbling, crazy society, actually it's a society that lives by the grid, and where not even a grid, it's a wire mesh, and everyone lives in their little given spaces. And then these characters are, it's not that they are dissidents really or dropouts, they are off-grid by birth or by who they are in some ways, where they belong geographically and socially. And so through their off-gridness, they illuminate the grid in some ways. But that sounds very clever. Huh? I mean, that I just made up later.
We realized it when you were writing it. But now that you have been touring and talking about the book, that you must be also kind of, it's appearing to you in interesting sort of ways, I'm sure. Since you're talking about the characters, I was wondering whether you would also tell us about all the non-human protagonists, that the book is filled with, Biru the dog, Agha and Khanam the cats, Zainab's goat that survives 16 Bakri Eids, Sultan the rooster who doesn't survive the military occupation in Kashmir. How do you see this world? I mean, it's really rare to find so many creatures in a novel, because usually novels are either about animals or they're about people, or they're about animals who are pets. But in this book, they are characters, and they have little biographies, and they have a mind of their own.
Well, I think, I grew up in this village in Imanam as a child, in a place where there was nothing. I mean, there were no shops, restaurants, nothing. You know, my playground was the river bank, and I knew every creature, every plant, every fish, everything. You know, and so I think I've always been that person who doesn't just, whose world doesn't just consist of human beings, you know, it never has been that. And of course, one of the joys of writing fiction for me is the joy of being able to describe landscape. You know, the God of Small Things to me, I mean, before I wrote it, I was a screenplay writer, and if it was a screenplay, I would have had to say exterior day, river. But to be able to just evoke that river, you know. And for me, similarly here, to be able to describe the landscape of the city, or the valley of Kashmir, or the desolateness outside of Delhi, and always what I love, and what also obviously it tears you up. Truly, I mean, even when you think about the descriptions of war and so on, you know, bombing of Afghanistan or Syria, and everyone just counts the human beings, and you just imagine everything else that was incinerated and destroyed and doesn't even deserve a mention. And Anjum and Saddam especially, Saddam is a character who rides through the town on this horse that is his business. She's his business partner, and he's a guy who just has a radar for animals. You know, he's always picking up creatures or rescuing them, and they have a life. So the border between humans and animals, between the living and the dead, is also sort of blurred in that graveyard and in the Jannat guest house.
You mentioned, you're writing screenplays, and you've written 2 screenplays for In Which Annie Gives It Those Ones and Electric Moon. And my question to you is that, did that shape you in some ways as a writer?
Yeah, well, I'm sure it did, in the sense that, those were amongst the earliest things I wrote, and it was a kind of discipline. You know, when you're writing screenplays, you learn economy, you know, because every little extra scene costs a lot to shoot. So you learn economy, and you learn to write dialogue. So I think those 2 things, it surely did teach me, you know.
And what about your training as an architect and an urban planner? Arundhati actually studied architecture, wrote a dissertation on urban planning, and topped her batch. And did that in some ways kind of help you in thinking about structures, for instance?
No, for me, the only reason to study architecture is to write a novel. It's a fundamental influence on the way I work.
No, but when you were studying architecture, did you know you were going to write a novel? Did you have aspirations?
When I studied architecture, my only aspiration was how to make it to the end of the week, you know, because I had left home and I had no money and I had no aspirations except those of survival. But somewhere today, you know, it's a great influence on me. I guess structuring it, but also, you know, through the years of writing the things I have written, even in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, there are moments which are part or echo my
dissertation,
my thesis in the School of Architecture, and thinking about the city was very much part of what I began to do when I was in my last few years there. Yeah, so It's a tremendous influence.
Has it found its way into the novel?
Yeah, it has. It has. That's what I was telling you.
And do you want to tell us exactly where? Or?
No, one of the things that, I mean, when I was in fifth year, my thesis was called Post-Colonial Urban Development in Delhi and what the city does to its people. And one of the things was about how the institutions of the city are designed in ways to exclude its poorest citizens. And I talked about the city and the non-city, the citizen and the non-citizen, how people are expected to live in the cracks between those institutions. I had to actually defend it to a jury, and I said, you know, the poor, even the sewage system doesn't belong to them, and they have to shit on top of the sewage system. And so, yeah, there's a moment in the book where that thought comes up. Let me just see if I can find it.
Could it be this? Can I find it for you?
You already marked it.
Yes. So I kind of subtly manipulating you to do
okay.
to follow my wishes.
Can I see? Wasn't even that subtle, Shwini. This is a description of Tilotama early in the morning, looking out of her little Barsati, waiting for Saddam Hussein to come and pick her up along with this baby that she's kidnapped from Jantar Mantar. And while she looks out, I'll just read it from the beginning. It says, pre-dawn, still no sign of Saddam Hussein. The kidnapper looked down from her window a little impatiently. A text message on her phone. Let us unite on International Yoga Day for poolside candlelight yoga and meditation by Guru Hanumant Bharadwaj. She tapped out a reply, please let's not. Right beside the school gate on which a painted nurse was giving a painted baby a painted polio vaccination, a circle of sleepy women, migrant workers from roadworks nearby, stood around a tiny boy as he squatted like a comma on the edge of an open manhole. The women leaned on their shovels and pickaxes as they waited for their star to perform. The comma had his eyes fixed on one of the women, his mother. The spirit moved him. He made a pool, a yellow leaf. His mother put down her axe and washed his bottom with muddy water from an old Bisleri bottle. With the leftover water, she washed her hands and washed the yellow leaf into the manhole. Nothing in the city belonged to the women, not a tiny plot of land, not a hovel in a slum, not a tin sheet over their heads, not even the sewage system. But now they had made a direct, unorthodox deposit, an express delivery straight into the system. Maybe it marked the beginning of a foothold in the city. The comma's mother gathered him up in her arms, slung her axe across her shoulder, and the little contingent left. The street was empty.
Thank you. Thanks so much. You know, this is also very typical of the book, these absolutely wonderful, illuminating vignettes, which to my mind are actually quite cinematic. But you don't seem to be very keen that your books be made into films, and I was wondering whether you would like to talk about that.
Well, I have quite a funny story about that. When The God of Small Things was published, obviously, like I mentioned earlier, when I wrote The God of Small Things, somewhere in my mind, I set out to write what I called a stubbornly visual but unfilmable book. Mm-hmm. So there was a sort of, it is very visual, but I actually don't think it would make a great film, reduced to verbs and adjectives and stuff. But when I was in Los Angeles, there were a lot of Hollywood filmmakers who would try to buy the rights. So my agent, David Godwin, at some point, I mean, he keeps saying, so-and-so wants it, so-and-so wants it, and I wouldn't reply. So once he says, look, Arundhati, they're willing to give you anything they want. What do you want? So I said, I want them to grovel, and then I want to say no. So he's like, oh, all right then, okay.
So that was the end.
That was the end.
When you were reading it out, it's pretty evident to everybody and to those who have read it that it's a book that is extremely, eminently readable. And a great diversity of people have actually read the book. But it's also, in some ways, a challenging read. And one of the people who reviewed it said that it requires a kind of readerly perseverance. Do you agree with that?
I do. I think that, I said that it was, I looked at it as a city, but truthfully, probably it's an underwater city. So you could choose whether you wanted to swim with the fish on the surface and then take a little dive and swim with the fish in the middle and then go deep down and swim with the bottom feeders, It's a book which I didn't want to, for me, something that you can just read and have read isn't much fun. Because even when I read it, find things, like some woman who's hidden money in various pockets of her clothes and suddenly discovers bits and things. And to me, it's not baby food. But it also can be, if you want it to be. But that's what I meant when I said I wanted to take a risk. That I had written that book, that big commercial bestseller. Not that I ever thought The God of Small Things was going to be that, but it became that. So I'm very interested in how can you take something like a novel and make it do what only a novel can do. What is that art form? We can push it to its limits, It's not a novel that wants to be an essay. It's not a novel that wants to be a film. It's a novel that wants to be a novel. And how can you also, I do feel sometimes that even the big commerce around literature, you go to the Frankfurt Book Fair and part of you feels relieved that there is commerce around literature. It's booming, great. But sometimes the speed at which it happens, it has to be categorized. You have to tell them in 3 sentences and 6 adjectives and which shelf is it going to be in, as if it has to have a heading or a subheading or a subject. Is it a love story? Is it a history book? Is it a political book? And I'm saying no. I'm not going to be able, I want to write something but I can't describe. I want to write something which is about the air we breathe. And the air we breathe has caste and gender and Kashmir and love and animals and cities and jokes and everything, Can we just write about what we breathe in and breathe out? Can we write where we're not afraid of intimacy? We're not afraid of politics. We're not afraid when the background becomes the foreground. We're not afraid of writing because, people are scared of writing often I'm asked, are you a writer or an activist? Because you're not supposed to write about political stuff and be a writer. But I want to say, come on, we live in places where politics kicks the door in at 3 a.m. Can you write a book where it's not just a few characters with a political backdrop, but you don't walk past anyone? The guard who's guarding the Honda City ad outside the public toilet is not just a guard. Can you just stop and smoke a cigarette with him and ask him where he's come from? Everybody, there's that sense in which that is how we live. And it is overwhelming sometimes, but eventually you get lost and you figure it out, you know.